The NBA has a problem on its hands right now, and the league may not fully appreciate the complexity of what it is dealing with. The postseason has produced something that, on the surface, looks like compelling, physical, intense basketball. And it is. Nobody is going to sit here and pretend that playoff intensity is not part of what makes this time of year appointment viewing. But there is a version of physical playoff basketball that exists on the right side of the line. And there is a version that consistently walks right up to that line, leans over it, and dares officials to respond. When officials repeatedly choose not to respond, when they allow that behavior to accumulate without consequence across multiple games and multiple possessions, they are not just tolerating it, they are guaranteeing that someone, eventually, is going to respond to it themselves.
That is exactly what happened in Game 4 between the Minnesota Timberwolves and the San Antonio Spurs. And the consequences of what unfolded in that building are going to ripple through this series and through the league's decision-making infrastructure in ways that deserve serious, unflinching examination. Let us establish what actually happened, because the sequence of events matters enormously to understanding the full picture. Victor Wembanyama, the Spurs' transcendent young center and the player who holds virtually every distinction available to him at this stage of his career, Defensive Player of the Year, two-time All-NBA First Team, two-time All-Defense First Team, two-time MVP, snapped in the third quarter of Game 4. Just 12 minutes into what was a pivotal swing game, Wembanyama swung an elbow that connected with Naus Reed. The officials reviewed the play, assessed a flagrant 2 foul, and ejected the most important player on the San Antonio Spurs roster from a postseason game that had enormous implications for the entire series' trajectory. Now, let us be honest about the call itself. In a vacuum, if you freeze that single moment in isolation, strip away every piece of context, remove every game and every series that preceded it, and just look at one elbow making contact with one face, yes, a flagrant 2 is a defensible call. The rule book exists for a reason. Player safety is a legitimate priority. Nobody disputes any of that. But here is the problem with evaluating that call in a vacuum. This game was not played in a vacuum. This series has not been played in a vacuum. The Minnesota Timberwolves have built their defensive identity around physicality that consistently tests the boundaries of what is permissible. They hold, they foul, they talk, they chip. They press and irritate and provoke game after game, possession after possession, in a manner that is relentless and deliberate. That is their brand. That is how they compete. And again, there is a version of that approach that is entirely legitimate and admirable in its toughness. But when that approach is permitted to operate without meaningful officiating intervention across the course of a full series, it does not simply continue at the same level. It escalates. It compounds. The players on the receiving end of it do not become numb to it. They become increasingly frustrated by it. And at some point, a player reaches a threshold, not because they are undisciplined or reckless, but because they are human beings competing in an intense environment where the normal release valve of officiating protection has been repeatedly left closed. Victor Wembanyama reached that threshold in Game 4. The elbow, by all visual evidence and by every reasonable reading of his body language and expression on the bench afterward, was not a calculated, targeted attempt to injure Naus Reed.
I don't know. Honestly, man, I think it was kind of harder. When every team is missing their best player, everybody plays free. They get more shots, more confident. So I think it was a lot harder, honestly.
He was not lying in wait for an opportunity. He was not hunting contact. He was flailing, reacting, operating in that heightened physical state that 12 minutes of playoff basketball against the Minnesota Timberwolves produces. The elbow connected. It should not have. And he was ejected. What makes this so significant is not just the ejection itself. It is the timing, the context, and the mathematical reality of what Wembanyama's presence means for the San Antonio Spurs. Consider the plus-minus numbers, because they tell a story that no amount of narrative can override. Wembanyama is sitting at a plus 11.8 in his on-off splits through this postseason. What that means in practical terms is that when he is on the floor, the San Antonio Spurs perform nearly 12 points better per 100 possessions than when he is sitting on the bench. 12 points per 100 possessions in the playoffs. That is not a role player's contribution. That is not a complementary piece making a marginal difference. That is a player whose presence fundamentally changes the competitive equation of every single minute he participates in. Compare that number to some of the other headlining names in the Western Conference playoff bracket. Anthony Edwards, the Timberwolves star and the face of their franchise, is currently sitting at a minus 15.3 in his on-off splits this postseason. That means the Minnesota Timberwolves are actually 15 points per 100 possessions better when Edwards is not on the floor. And then there is Shai Gilgeous-Alexander, the back-to-back league MVP, who is at minus 11.1 in his on-off numbers for the Oklahoma City Thunder this postseason. His team performs better without him on the floor by 11 points per 100 possessions. Now, those numbers require some contextual nuance. Lineup combinations, opponent strength, and sample size all play a role in how on-off splits shake out over a relatively short playoff sample, but the directional reality is impossible to dismiss entirely. The Spurs genuinely need Wembanyama on the floor in a way that is measurable, demonstrable, and significant. He is not a player they can absorb losing for 3+ quarters of a pivotal playoff game and expect normal competitive outcomes, which is exactly why the officiating judgment call in this situation deserved more careful consideration than it received.
He's gotten chucked, he's gotten pushed down in transition, running freely, all the stuff. He doesn't complain one time. We don't complain because we're just going to play. We don't really give a shit, excuse my language. But at some stage, he should be protected. And if not, he's going to have to protect himself. And unfortunately, stuff like that happens.
The argument is not that the officials should have ignored the play. The argument is that officiating in playoff basketball has always involved an element of contextual judgment, reading the moment, understanding what produced it, and making a call that serves the integrity of the competition rather than simply applying the rulebook with mechanical precision. There was a reasonable path to a flagrant one assessment in this situation. A flagrant one would have punished the behavior, sent a message, and kept Wembanyama in the game. The officials had the ability to make that choice. They chose differently, and the ripple effects of that choice shaped the entire remainder of Game 4. Here is what followed the ejection, and this is the part of the story that deserves enormous credit. Credit directed at the San Antonio Spurs and their response to an extraordinarily difficult situation. Wembanyama played 12 minutes before being removed. In those 12 minutes, he had contributed 4 points, 4 rebounds, and registered a -1 on the plus-minus scale. He was not at his best before the ejection. The historic Game 3 performance was fresh in everyone's memory, and the physical wear of this series was visibly affecting his rhythm in the early minutes of Game 4. But despite that, despite losing their most important player for virtually the entire game, the San Antonio Spurs responded. They controlled the third quarter. They led by as many as 8 points in the fourth quarter. They were still up by 1 possession with 3 minutes remaining in regulation. A young, inexperienced roster playing without its franchise cornerstone put itself in position to take a 3-1 series lead against a desperate Timberwolves team playing with everything on the line. That is remarkable. That is the kind of collective resilience that speaks to roster depth, coaching preparation, and competitive character in ways that regular season results simply cannot replicate. The Spurs proved something meaningful about who they are as a team in that stretch of Game 4, regardless of the ultimate outcome. But the ultimate outcome is what it is, and it was shaped by several converging factors that all require honest accounting. First, the Minnesota Timberwolves were playing with genuine desperation, facing a potential 3-1 series deficit with their best player generating negative on-off numbers. They needed everything to go right. And in the fourth quarter, Anthony Edwards gave them everything they needed. He was extraordinary down the stretch, 16 points on 6 of 8 shooting in the final quarter alone. That is elite performance under maximum pressure, and it deserves full acknowledgement regardless of the broader context of how this series has been played. Edwards delivered when his team needed him most, and that is the definition of a competitive postseason contributor. Second, and critically, head coach Mitch Johnson made a substitution decision in the fourth quarter that ultimately cost the Spurs on the glass. Luke Kornet had played 26 significant minutes following the Wembanyama ejection and performed well, defending the rim, securing rebounds, providing the size and physicality that the Spurs needed in their front court without their starter. And then Johnson went small. He pulled Kornet off the floor at a moment when the rebounding battle had become the defining factor of the possession game. The numbers from that final quarter were punishing. The Spurs were out-rebounded 15-10 overall in the fourth quarter, with 5 of those Minnesota advantages coming on the offensive glass. 5 offensive rebounds leading directly to second-chance opportunities for a desperate Timberwolves team in a one-possession game. That is the kind of margin that decides playoff games, and it was produced, at least in part, by a coaching decision to go small at the exact moment when size and physicality on the glass were most essential. Johnson spoke well after the game about his team's response to the ejection, and the pride he expressed was warranted, but the substitution pattern in the fourth quarter is a legitimate tactical question that he will need to have an answer for heading into Game 5. Third, and perhaps most cruelly for the Spurs, the shots that were falling in the third quarter and in the early portions of the fourth simply stopped falling down the stretch. They were executing. They were getting the looks they needed. The ball just was not going in. Basketball is, at its most elemental level, a make-or-miss proposition. Shots that are made in the first three quarters do not earn credit in the fourth, and the Spurs, in the moments when they needed their offense to sustain the lead, went cold. Even with all of that, the ejection, the fourth quarter cold spell, the rebounding disadvantage created by the small lineup, Edwards going berserk, it still took a full length of the court pass and what can only be described as a miraculous catch by Iosu Dunu with under 15 seconds remaining to keep the Timberwolves alive. That play was the defining moment of the game, and it was as improbable as any single play you will see in a playoff series. Without it, the San Antonio Spurs likely had possession and a chance to tie or win with the final possession of regulation. Realistically, this should be a 3-1 series for San Antonio. The evidence of the 4 games played suggests strongly that the Spurs are the superior team in this matchup. Mitch Johnson addressed that directly in his post-game comments, expressing genuine pride in how his group competed and performed in the face of losing their best player for essentially the entirety of the contest. He also addressed the question of what the league should do next regarding Wembanyama. His position was clear. The ejection should constitute the full extent of the league's response. The penalty has already been paid. Wembanyama was removed from the floor for over 3/4 of a pivotal playoff game. The Spurs absorbed that consequence and nearly won anyway. Any additional suspension would cross a line that the history of this league's disciplinary record makes very clear. The comparisons being drawn, should a suspension be issued, are not casual or hyperbolic. They reach back to Draymond Green's suspension in 2016 and the Amari Stoudemire and Boris Diaw suspensions in 2007, 2 of the most debated and consequential disciplinary decisions in NBA playoff history. Those decisions altered series outcomes. They altered championship trajectories. They remain, years later, sources of legitimate controversy about whether the league's mechanical application of its own rules served or undermined the competitive integrity of its most important product. The expectation, and it is a reasonable one, is that the NBA will not suspend Wembanyama for Game 5. The league understands what is at stake commercially and competitively. A Wembanyama versus Edwards matchup in a pivotal swing game is exactly what the postseason requires. A fine is the appropriate additional measure if any further action is taken at all. But the deeper issue, the one that will outlast this series regardless of how it concludes, is the question of officiating standards for physical play that approaches the boundary of what is permissible. The Minnesota Timberwolves approach is not going to change because of what happened in Game 4. It is who they are. It is how they compete. And there is nothing inherently wrong with toughness, physicality, and defensive aggression as a competitive identity. What cannot be permitted, however, is for that approach to operate in an officiating environment that tolerates accumulating provocation without response and then reacts with maximum severity the moment a player on the receiving end of that provocation finally responds. That is not balance. That is not consistent application of standards. That is a system that protects the aggressor and punishes the responder, and it produces exactly the kind of ejection that derailed Game 4. If the league wants to allow physical, chippy, boundary-testing basketball, that is a legitimate choice. The fans largely enjoy it. The intensity it produces is real and compelling. But the officials must then be prepared to manage the consequences of that environment in real time, to recognize when a series has reached a boiling point, to give the players on the receiving end some protection before they are forced to provide it themselves, and to exercise the contextual judgment that the moment requires rather than defaulting to mechanical rule application that removes the most important player from a pivotal playoff game. Victor Wembanyama should not have thrown that elbow. That is not a defense of the action. It is simply an honest honest acknowledgement of reality, but the conditions that produced that elbow were allowed to develop over the course of this series without adequate officiating intervention. And when you allow those conditions to fester without relief, you should not be surprised when the pressure eventually finds an exit. The Spurs are the better team. The numbers say so. The 4 games of evidence say so. Game 5 will say so again with Wembanyama on the floor for a full 40 minutes and a young roster that has already demonstrated it can compete at the highest level under the most difficult circumstances imaginable. The league should let the best basketball decide this series from here. Get out of the way, let the players play, and perhaps in the process have a genuine internal conversation about what officiating standards actually look like when the physicality of playoff competition reaches the level this series has reached. Because if that conversation does not happen, the next ejection is not a possibility. It is a guarantee.